If you've ever taken the Amtrak through Altoona, Pennsylvania, you've experienced what's known as the Horseshoe Curve. It's actually a national historic landmark. There's a viewing platform there where train buffs can watch as trains come up and do this hairpin or horseshoe turn in a very short span. I think we have a slide of that actually. I don't know if that could be shown, but I remember traveling on this train back in the 1970s. Yeah, there it is. Loops around. And how fascinating it was to watch out the window as the tail end of the same train I was on snaked past, seemingly moving in the opposite direction. Like the Sankofa, it's a symbol of looking back at where we've come from in order to better understand how to move forward. So in this sermon, I just want to circle back and retrieve a few moments from my ministry, share a few stories, beginning with the story of my ordination service, which took place 40 years ago, tomorrow, at the First Parish Unitarian Church in Weston, Massachusetts. I had chosen the overall theme of Jonah for the service, selecting the music and the readings to build upon that biblical story, which was and still is one of my favorites. I think we have a slide of that as well. Actually, this is a print by the artist John August Swanson. It hangs over my workspace at home. I had chosen this theme because it's a story about an inner struggle in response to an outer call. And I had struggled long and hard with my decision whether or not to enter the ministry. I wasn't at all sure that I was right for the role. Jonah, of course, also struggled mightily with his, in response to a calling, go to Nineveh, those of you who are familiar with the story, and he ran in the opposite direction, seeking to Tarshish, seeking to escape. Well, you know how that story turns out, I think. But the entire story of Jonah is a story about repentance, of what in Hebrew is called teshuvah, which means literally turning or returning. It's more than just a moralistic sense of regret and a desire to do things differently, although that can be part of it. But it really involves a radical reorientation of almost physical turning about face, turning in another direction in order to see things differently. The book of Jonah actually is read in synagogues on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. So you know it's it's not a silly little cartoon. It's a story with a deep significance about what it means to turn in the direction of our calling. So at my ordination service, the whole book of Jonah was read. It's a short book. And then my mentor, Brother Blue, took the stage. I need to tell you a little bit about Brother Blue, the man who, perhaps more than any other single person, was responsible for shaping the direction of my ministry. I met him in the fall of 1978, shortly after I had moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to begin divinity school. I didn't meet him in the classroom, though. I met him on the street one afternoon while I was wandering through Harvard Square, probably in search of a used bookstore. His name was Hugh Morgan Hill, although I didn't learn that until much later. For the time being, I knew him only as Brother Blue. I see you've already got a picture of him. It was an appropriate name. He was dressed in like 7 shades of blue, from his faded suede shoes and his light blue socks up past his navy denim jeans and his turquoise beaded belt, all the way up to this huge floppy indigo colored beret atop his head. And there were beautiful rainbows embroidered in his sky colored shirt, and a big bright enameled butterfly was pinned to his royal blue vest. And he also had colorful butterflies painted on his bony brown cheeks and on the palms of his fluttering hands. And there were curly, multicolored ribbons sprouting out of his sleeves like stuffing from a psychedelic scarecrow. And he also had, if I remember correctly at the time, 2 or 3 helium balloons attached by strings to various parts of his costume. As you can imagine, well, as you can see, he was hard to miss, even in the busy and crowded atmosphere of Harvard Square. I think there are a few more pictures. Yeah, that's very like the day I met him, actually. And the first words he ever spoke to me were, "Peekaboo." You have to understand, he said that to everyone. But for some reason, those simple, silly words touched a place deep inside of me. They penetrated my intellectual and emotional armor and entered my heart. As Brother Blue himself would probably have put it, as he said many times, he had succeeded in reaching the soul that be in the middle of me. So I fell instantly in love with this man, the way some Eastern disciples are said to fall in love with their guru. I was caught by surprise. He scared me, he fascinated me, he delighted me, and he invited me into his life. So the next 5 years, I spent a lot of time hanging out with him, listening to his stories, remembering some of my own, learning to play peekaboo with the world. And along with a few other students at the divinity school, I even applied for and managed to receive academic credit for this peculiar apprenticeship. It was called theological field education, and we really did cover the field. You see, he called himself a peripatetic storyteller. That meant he traveled around a lot, spanning the globe, really, spinning his magic web of stories anywhere and everywhere. Schools, hospitals, folk festivals, prisons, nursing homes, theaters, television and film studios, city parks, libraries, even churches. But mostly he told stories in the street because he said that's where people's lives are at. He was a street preacher by calling and by choice. He had a bachelor's degree from Harvard, a Master of Fine Arts from the Yale School of Drama, and a doctorate from Union Institute. A deeply spiritual person, he viewed his storytelling as a sacred vocation, a ministry. Every story, he said, is praying out loud. Now, Brother Blue never went anywhere without his beloved wife, Ruth, who used to bring home-baked bread to every one of our classes. There's a picture of the two of them. And at the end of each session, Brother Blue would declare, "If I've left anything unsaid, it's there in the bread." So we shared that kind of communion. So I was honored when Brother Blue accepted the invitation to speak at my ordination. What he offered that day was a kind of jazz improvisational commentary on the story of Jonah. He retold the tale in such a way that the entire church sanctuary became, for the duration of the telling, the belly of the whale. I think we have a slide about showing these great arched wooden beams stretching overhead, those rafters that had been hewn out of the New England forest by Yankee shipbuilders. They became the huge creature's ribs. And the heavy oak doors through which we had all entered, those doors were its mouth, now firmly closed. And all of us were there, wrapped in a magical, mythical dream time and sacred space, a womb in which all of the possibilities of our lives were vividly imaginable. We were enchanted, held in a wizard's spell. Now, the details of the story that Brother Blue told that day are not important. In fact, I've forgotten them. What is important and what I do remember is the feeling of being lured and led along by the power and beauty of the story itself, a narrative that somehow included me with all of my questions, struggles, choices, doubts, hopes, fears, and desires. I felt that I'd been swept away and carried along on my own life's great sea journey by the sheer power of the story. I was transported, like Jonah, powerfully and fearfully and wonderfully, until at last I was heaved up on the dry ground of the ordinary world, feeling amazed and a little bit dazed, but fully alive and eager to get on with the journey. I felt commissioned, empowered, sent. In other words, truly ordained. So from the very beginning of my ministry then, stories have been at the center. So that story listening, storytelling, story sharing, that focus has always been central to my ministry. Stories are the spiritual substance that I find at the center. They are also the means by which I find my way to that center. The great Jewish theologian Martin Buber tells a story that I think illustrates very well the healing and transformative power of narrative. Buber's grandfather, who in his old age was quite infirm, had once been a disciple of the famous Rabbi Baal Shem Tov. And when he was asked to tell a story about his teacher, the old man described how his rabbi, when he prayed, would jump up and down and dance in the Hasidic fashion. And in the process of telling this story, Buber says, his old grandfather would rise from his chair and, carried away by the emotion of the narrative, would begin to move and dance about the room, forgetting in his own ecstasy that he was lame. Buber concludes, that's the way to tell a story. I remember a similar scenario with Brother Blue. He had received a set of slave chains as a gift from Conrad Wright, the professor of Unitarian Church history at Harvard Divinity School. And Brother Blue would often use them in his storytelling. I remember once him telling a story at the Suffolk County Jail, a story about freedom. And as he talked, he would shake those chains. He would move and dance and sing his powerful and liberating story. The story embodied and expressed the very freedom that was its message. The telling of the story was itself an act of liberation. That's what stories are for. And I feel something of that freedom whenever I talk about Brother Blue. Simply by telling stories about him, I can feel his excitement, his enthusiasm, his freedom. And in a certain sense, I experience a healing or revitalization of those parts in me that are wounded, lame, or enslaved, in need of liberation and transformation. Brother Blue gave me the confidence and the faith that ministry could indeed be a path with heart for me. Second story. The summer after my ordination, in June of 1993, I received what is called preliminary fellowship during the service of the living tradition at the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association. It was held in Vancouver, British Columbia that year. You saw a glimpse of the order of service, the one with the totem pole on it. Preliminary fellowship is a three-year probationary trial period, following which, if all goes well, ministers enter into full fellowship. I glanced, by the way, at the back cover of that order of service when I scanned the image, and it appears that I'm the only member of my cohort that year, those who were in my same preliminary fellowship cohort. I'm the only one that's still active in parish ministry today, so that's rather sobering. The preacher on that occasion was the Reverend Dr. Philip Hewitt of the First Unitarian Church of Vancouver. And I can still see him standing there in the raised pulpit of this large cathedral-like church, wearing his preaching robes, a tall, handsome, distinguished-looking gentleman with a shock of white hair brushed back from his high forehead. He'd been born and raised in England and still spoke with that cultivated accent in a style that some might have considered pompous or pretentious, but which I found captivating in an old school kind of way. Like Brother Blue, Hewitt based his sermon on a biblical text, except in this case, it was an obscure little scrap of scripture from the first book of Samuel, describing a time when the future King David was still a young outlaw, a guerrilla fighter, roaming the hills of Judea, seeking a place of refuge from his enemies, which he found in a cave owned by a man named Adullam. The title of the sermon was The Cave of Adullam. Nobody knew what the heck that meant. But it was the next verse that provided the basis for Hewitt's reflection. It reads like this: "And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became their leader." In other words, all who were alienated, all who had a grievance, everyone who had an axe to grind, those who had an agenda, everyone who was upset about something, you get the picture. The point of Dr. Hewitt's sermon was that whatever our ideals might be, the realities of congregational life were filled with conflict and misunderstandings and battles over money and arguments and power struggles. It was a sobering wake-up call for his audience, especially for those of us who were just entering the ministry, eager. Those recent seminary graduates who in a previous era, Ralph Waldo Emerson had called the newborn bards of the Holy Spirit. We sat up straight and listened. What had we got ourselves into? Reverend Hewitt further seemed to be suggesting that there was something about Unitarian Universalist congregations in particular, with our reputation for tolerance of religious dissent, that may make us a target and a haven for malcontents and troublemakers. While his warning was salutary, in retrospect, it may have been exaggerated. Things have changed. No doubt I have encountered such difficulties. But when I began my ministry, many, many people came through our doors as religious refugees, often with strong grievances against their former tradition. All of our programming was set up based on that assumption and expectation that these come-outers, as they were called, had been so alienated by their past involvement in religious community that we would studiously avoid any language that might remind them of that past. They were exes coming out of a difficult divorce, and we didn't want to talk about their former spouse. Nowadays, people are far less likely to show up at our doors with a strong animus against religion. They're more likely to have grown up without any strong religious affiliation of any kind. They're not rebelling against their former religion, but are curious, open, willing to give this spirituality thing a try. They want to know what's at the center of this tradition, what lies at the gravitational core of this religiously energetic field, what lies at the middle of our sacred circle. And that was also the question taken up by a group of about 400 Unitarian Universalist ministers who gathered in the spring of 1995 at a special convocation in Hot Springs, Arkansas. The stated purpose of the meeting was to attempt to discern the vital center of our religious movement and to name those core values and practices that we would need in order to minister effectively well into the 21st century. We gathered for 5 days of earnest, open, searching conversation in small groups and larger plenary sessions, with an occasional break to worship and to visit the famous spas or to tour Bill Clinton's childhood home. It happened at a time of transition in my life. It was a powerful, memorable experience for me. We went through reams and reams of newsprint, but ultimately failed to arrive at a consensus. At the end of the week, there were two major contending schools of thought. One felt very strongly that reason stood at the heart of our tradition. Ours is the rational religion par excellence. None of this superstitious, supernatural stuff. We are the church of reason. The other wing felt equally strongly that love, again with a capital L, stood at the center of our religious tradition. Now, those of you who know me may not be surprised to learn that I was in the love camp. Reason, I felt and feel, was an important instrumental value, a tool like a knife and a fork that we use as eating utensils. We need to use reason in religion, like we use silverware to eat, but we don't eat our silverware. The substantive value of our tradition, the nourishing stuff at the very core, had to be something like love. We had long, deep, searching, and respectful conversations with one another, but in the end, and some not so respectful, I must say, we couldn't reach a consensus, and the center was left empty, unoccupied, unidentified, unnamed. And some of my colleagues were deeply disappointed with this outcome, but in my view, the gathering was far from a failure. We learned a lot. I found myself thinking of Robert Frost's little poem, "We dance round in a ring and suppose the secret sits in the middle and knows." The center may always remain elusive, a mystery, a kind of secret, but it exerts its strange gravitational pull all the same. Our theological center will never have the mathematical precision of a single point or the dogmatic certainty of a fundamentalist doctrine or creed. As Unitarian Universalists, our center is not a revered person or a holy book or a sacred geography, but a set of principles, a cluster of core values. The current constellation of those values is hanging on the wall over there. And I well remember the process by which these principles were put together, along with the sources that accompany them. In the early 1980s, just as I was beginning my ministry, congregations were invited to participate in a grassroots democratic process to create a covenant that identified and named our core values, our common center. And this was in the days before the internet, so remember, these are the original booklets that were sent out with questions and soliciting feedback. I remember how impressed I was this is over a 2-year period, how impressed I was by the grassroots nature of this process in a religion, a tradition that would practice that way. I was very impressed. So these principles have served us well for almost 40 years. We've organized our hymn book around them, for example, and religious curricula as well. But there's a sunset clause built into the bylaws of the Unitarian Universalist Association that requires us to examine this covenant every 15 years. It's remarkable when you think about a sunset clause with regard to our deepest religious convictions. We have to reflect and re-examine them. And we're due for that, right? We're way overdue, actually. So this process, again, is underway. Not using paper books like this, but it has been online. In fact, the report from the commission that drafted a revision for these principles was just released last week, and it's available online. Well, I'll be sure you get the link if you're interested. It's about a 25-page report, very interesting. But even before that, in 2017, the Unitarian Universalist Association released a report called Widening the Circle of Concern. And that report takes a critical look at the ways that our own institutional structures at every level have historically evolved in ways that exclude and obstruct marginalized communities and individuals from participating fully in our congregations. And as I say, you can read that report, but I'll summarize it for you quickly here. The bottom line is an invitation to learn and to practice what the Unitarian Universalist religious educator C.B. Beale calls preemptive radical inclusion. I love that phrase, preemptive radical inclusion. This means recognizing and realizing who's missing from our circle of kinship and thinking ahead proactively about what they'll experience when they do come through our doors and attempt to enter our circle of kinship. Widening the circle of concern is appropriate and necessary work for us at this time. When I think of widening the circle, though, I think not only of expanding the circumference, but also of strengthening and deepening our shared relationship to the common center. Having an equal relationship to the center is the very definition of a circle, after all. The radius of a circle is the same to each point along its sweeping circumference. And similarly, the relationship to its own center is what makes a community rather than a mere collection of individuals or a crowd or an audience. So even as the periphery expands, each point along that circular orbit retains a vital connection to the center. One of my professors back in divinity school used to call that radial faith. In other words, it's along the radius. That radius between the circumference and the center, that is the direction of one's faith. So without a shared relationship to a vital and challenging center, what we call community can easily degenerate into an exclusive club, a kind of approval vortex that's built on nothing more substantial than mutually reinforcing likes and dislikes, defining who's inside and who's outside the boundary of our particular circle. So, just as at the beginning of my ministry, the UUA is now in the process of formulating its statement of core values. So this language will almost certainly be revised, probably quite radically revised over the next couple of years. It'll be discussed and debated at the General Assembly in Pittsburgh this coming June. So you can read the report, but I just wanted to share one final graphic. I think you can put that slide up now, that this accompanies the report from the commission. This is kind of the direction the thinking is moving. And what do you notice about this? I mean, given what I've been talking about here, what's at the center? Yeah, this is what is being proposed as an alternative way. Now, each of these values listed on the outer spokes, if you dig a little deeper, there's expansions, verbal expansions. What do we mean by interdependence? What do we mean by equity, and so on? There's further pages, but this is on the face of it. This is the visual diagram that is attempting to represent the direction we're going. I guess what goes around comes around. Although I don't know that this will survive in its present form, but I just wanted you to see that. And you'll have a chance to explore this more deeply in a couple of weeks when the Sunday service team will be talking about this with you, leading you through this. Now, I'm wrapping this up here. I wanted to say that finding our center may always prove to be elusive. an elusive task. I've taken the title of this sermon, of course, from the Grateful Dead song that we heard during gathering music. Sometimes the light's all shining on me. Other times I can barely see. Lately it occurs to me what a long, strange trip it's been. And when I reflect back on my journey to the center, what comes to mind for me is an image of a labyrinth. I don't have an image of a labyrinth to show you, but if you've ever walked a labyrinth, if you've ever entered into a labyrinth, you know that sometimes it seems as though you're headed directly on a beeline to the center, and then suddenly, you swoop out into the outer margin and then curl back in and around, and you're close to the center at one moment, then you're back out. But the thing about a labyrinth, unlike a maze, you can never get lost in a labyrinth. It's impossible. In a true labyrinth, if you stay on the path, you will find your way to the center and back out again. So I know that there have been so many twists and turns that have taken me close and then back out again, swerving to the edge. Ministry is and always has been a strange vocation. It requires embracing strangeness, to use the words of the poet Pat Schneider, a certain willingness to go to the limit, to the edge, and at the same time to live not knowing. What we are all seeking, Schneider writes, is the common everyday walk in the awareness of mystery. Mystery, she says, isn't always strange. What is strange is how seldom we see it, how seldom we hear it. Mystery does not have to be paid for by any belief. It doesn't go away. We're the ones who go away, walk away, run away, flee, perhaps like Jonah, only to be brought back again and again to the path that moves toward the center inexorably. So as I look back on the 40 years of my strange, mysterious, wonderful journey, I recognize times when the light has been shining brightly, illuminating my path, and other times when I felt lost and baffled and confused, far from my center indeed. And in all of that, I have come to trust that my path will circle around again, find its way back to the center, a center that has always been there, right in my backyard, buried under the apple tree. I'd like to close with these words from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. I think sometimes I don't think this was conscious, but they constitute a kind of rejoinder to the poem by Yeats that I read earlier. This is what Rilke writes. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I circle around God, around the primordial tower. I've been circling for thousands of years, and I still don't know. Am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? Amen.